Honourable member for Glengarry-Prescott-Russell.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in House today on Red Dress Day, a national awareness day for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls called attention to this tragedy and emphasized the need for all of us to address the pain and injustice. This is a horrible tragedy for Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA people, and we need to make sure the recommendations become a reality. For those who had the courage to speak out, we continue to honor them, and it is our duty as parliamentarians not only to raise awareness among Canadians, but also to take action to put an end to this tragedy. Thank you.
The honourable member for Nunavut.
I rise to amplify the inherent rights of Indigenous peoples in Canada. Reclaiming Power and Place, the final report of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls found that, quote, Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA peoples are holders of inherent Indigenous rights, constitutional rights, and international and domestic human rights. The report calls on the full implementation on the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Calls for Justice 1.2 states, we call upon all governments with the full participation of Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA peoples to immediately implement and fully comply with all relevant rights, instruments, including but not limited to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
The honourable member for Vancouver East.
The Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry cited housing and homelessness over 200 times in its final report. Indigenous women are not inherently vulnerable. This is a result of colonization. Access to safe, secure, affordable housing can play a key role towards stopping this genocide. Yet the Liberals has consistently failed to ensure there is a dedicated housing strategy for Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit. Will the Prime Minister take immediate action to correct this gross oversight, or will he allow this ongoing genocide to continue?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the question. I'm glad to be able to start by recognizing that today is Red Dress Day, and on this day we mourn and honor missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and LGBTQ2+ people. I also want to say to the member opposite that our government absolutely agrees with her that housing is an essential part of the problem and needs to be an essential part of the solution. That is why housing was a core focus of the budget we tabled last month, including absolutely investing in Indigenous housing. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Churchill-Keewatinook, Aski.
Mr. Speaker, there is not one community in northern Manitoba that hasn't been devastated by the brutal murder or disappearance of an Indigenous woman, girl, or two-spirited person. Here at home, people are calling for action to end this genocide, immediate action on the 231 calls to justice, action to end poverty, the housing crisis, and discrimination. Les libéraux disent...
The Liberals say it is important, but where is it in the budget? Enough of the rhetoric. The government must act to ensure that no more Indigenous women, girls or two-spirited people disappear. Let us put an end to this genocide now. The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Merci, Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for this very important question. Today is Red Dress Day, and today we honour the women, the girls, and LGBTQ2 people who have disappeared or been murdered.
Is not enough, that we must work every day to end violence against Indigenous women, girls, and LGBTQ2+ people. That is why the budget includes significant investments in this ongoing work, as did previous budgets, Mr. Speaker.
For Winnipeg Centre.
Mr. Speaker, the Liberal government has acknowledged that there has been a genocide against Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people, but their inaction speaks louder than their words. They have had the calls for justice from the National Inquiry for 3 years, but the government has failed to implement them. They are also sitting on money that was allocated in 2021 in response to the calls for justice. And while they drag their feet, Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit are dying. When will the minister implement the calls for justice and get the money out the door and save Indigenous lives?
The Honourable Minister of Crown-Indigenous Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the member opposite for the passion and the words that she shared with us yesterday and today with respect to murdered and missing Indigenous women, which is a tragedy that sadly is ongoing in this country, and it's only been exacerbated by the pandemic. The monies that we've announced through the last budgetary cycle and the present one are ones that are directly targeted to have a systemic approach to reducing that the violence and the insecurity that's constantly felt by women and the tragedy that is ongoing. Unfortunately, the results are trailing, but we need to continue as a country, as a government, as a society in raising this issue and these matters and making sure that everyone can feel safe in this country.
Excellent. The Honourable Member for Winnipeg Centre.
Mr. Speaker, Indigenous women are dying while the minister makes excuses. Today, media is reporting that Indigenous women make up half the population of incarcerated persons in federal prisons. The over-incarceration of Indigenous women has actually been getting worse under this government. There is a call for justice to put in place a deputy commissioner to oversee Indigenous programs and to work with Indigenous communities. But, surprise, the Liberals haven't gotten it done. When will this government start addressing systemic racism and implement all the calls for justice?
That's right. The Honourable Minister of Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, on today of all days, we must acknowledge the continued legacy of colonialism in our justice system. The vast overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples, including women, is unacceptable. And that's why we're committed to taking action by implementing culturally sensitive training, increased representation of Indigenous peoples in our justice system, the legislation that's being put forward by the Minister of Justice to repeal mandatory minimum penalties, and of course a whole suite of other reforms. I'm committed, and I know my colleagues are on this side of the House, to working with the NDP, with my honourable colleague, to ensure that we walk the path of reconciliation. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Halifax West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Today is Red Dress Day, a date for all to remember the missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and LGBTQ+ people. A national day for Canadians to reflect and recognize that we must all take action. Indigenous peoples know what their priorities are. They've been voicing their needs, and that culturally appropriate approaches will best help those who need support so they can work towards healing and closure. Mr. Speaker, can the Minister of Crown-Indigenous Relations tell us what the Government of Canada is doing to develop accessible and culturally relevant healing programs and support for children, families, and survivors of this national tragedy?
The Honourable Minister of Crown-Indigenous Relations.
The pain and loss felt by families and survivors of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and the lack of safety felt today, is a tragedy that's ongoing and has only been exacerbated by the pandemic. Indigenous women and girls have the right to be and feel safe anywhere in this country, and tragically this is not the case today. This can only be achieved by continued investments in shelters, safe spaces, cultural spaces, and housing, coupled with culturally appropriate mental health services. We've made significant, indeed historic investments in the areas, but do recognize that much more work needs to be done, and we'll continue to do this alongside Indigenous partners.
Hear, hear. The Honourable Member for Peterborough-Kawartha.
Our country is in a mental health crisis. The first hurdle to getting help is to seek it out. But the people who have the courage to go and ask for help are being denied that help. People are literally dying, waiting for help. My question is, the Liberals promised $4.5 billion via Canada Mental Health Transfer during the election campaign, which was promised to start in 2022. Yet in recent budget, there is nothing. Zero. There is nothing for the Canada Mental Health Transfer. Why?
The Honourable Minister of Mental Health and Addictions.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the member for the question and for the recognition of this as Mental Health Week as we increase the awareness coast to coast to coast. As you know, in 2017, we dedicated $5 billion over the next 10 years. We've added $45 million to develop the national standards that will then become the strategy that then will become the transfer. We have to build this bottom up with those with lived and living experience.